Chapter 6 talks about structural analysis with special focus on trusses, which are structures commonly used in constructions. A truss is a structure composed of slender members joined together at their endpoints. In the figure here we can see an example of a typical rough supporting truss. In this figure, the roof load is transmitted to the truss at the joints by means of a series of purlins. Purlins are these beams that we see in the figure. Since the loading acts in the same plane as the truss, the analysis of the force developed in the truss members will be a two-dimensional problem, like we see in the B figure. In order to study to analyze a truss, we do two main assumptions. Assumption number one is that all loads are applied to the joints. Assumption number two is that the joints, the members are joined together by smooth pins. So basically all of these are smooth pins. Now in reality, sometimes we can see that these connections are not exactly pins. So for example, if we look at a figure like in another common application for trusses is a bridge. The joints will be attached with gasset plates in some cases, plates like the one shown in this picture, which are not exactly smooth pins, but for analysis application we can just consider them to be smooth pins. In other cases, like in other types of structure, we actually do have smooth pins, exactly like we're assuming. So, but in order to perform an analysis of the loads on our trusses, we'll be always assuming that the joints are connected by smooth pins, like the one shown in this picture. Now, because of these assumptions, we will have that all the members in a truss will be under either tension or compression. So each truss, each member will act as a two-force member. How do we analyze a structure of this type? There are two main methods. The first one that we look in this video is called the joint methods. The idea, so let's look at this structure, for example. This method is based on the fact that if the entire truss is in equilibrium, then each joint is also in equilibrium. So if the entire structure in this figure A is in equilibrium, then each of the joints has to be in equilibrium also. So the joint method consists in looking just at one joint. For example, here we can look at B. We look at the force acting on it. Then we know that each of the two members on it will act on the joint, and it can act only with either a tension or a compression. So we can decide arbitrarily how to orientate the force acting on the pin. Now be careful that if the member is under tension, then the force that is applying on the joint is coming out of the joint because of the third law of Newton. If the member is instead under compression, then it will push on the pin. So I can either orientate the two forces acting on the pin based on what intuitively I think will be the orientation of these forces, or I will just decide an arbitrary direction, for example by assuming that all members are under tension, and then by solving the equations I will find if that assumption is correct. So in this case, for example, I'm basically just solving a problem for a particle, not even a rigid body. So the problem is even simpler than the ones we have been seeing before, because all I have to do is solving sum of the forces on x equal to 0, sum of the forces on y is equal to 0. Solving these two equations, I will find FBA and FBC. Now, once I know these two forces, I can move on and go and look at joint A and joint C, if I'm interested into that. The method of joints is consisting just looking at each joint singularly. The important part of it is that, of course, I have always to start at a joint where there are only two unknowns, because I only have two equations. So I can't start from a joint where there are more than two unknowns. If, for example, here in B there was another member acting on it, well, then B would not have been a good candidate to start the structural analysis for this truss. In the next video, we'll look at a practical application of this method.